I never thought our marriage would come to this, Mark said, swirling his whiskey glass, the amber liquid catching the dim light of the living room. I glanced at him from across the couch, fidgeting with the edge of my sweater. What's that supposed to mean? He sighed, leaning forward, his elbows on his knees. It's not that I don't love you, Sarah. I do. But don't you feel like something's missing? I swallowed hard, not sure how to respond. The truth was, I did feel it too. The spark that had once defined our relationship had dimmed over the years, replaced by routine and predictability. Maybe we just need something new, he said, his voice lower now, almost conspiratorial. New like what? I asked, my brow furrowing. He hesitated, his gaze flickering to me before he took a long sip of his drink. I was talking to Horst the other day. He had an interesting suggestion. I blinked, caught off guard by the mention of Mark's old friend. Horst? What does he have to do with this? Mark smiled, a strange mix of excitement and nervousness in his expression. You'll see. Trust me, Sarah. This could be exactly what we need. The following evening, Mark came home with a bottle of wine and a sly grin. I talked to Horst, he said, setting the wine on the counter. And? I asked, crossing my arms. He's in, Mark said simply. In for what, exactly? You'll find out tomorrow night, he replied, pouring us each a glass. Just keep an open mind. I wanted to press him further, but something in his tone stopped me. Instead, I took the glass he offered, the tension between us thick enough to cut with a knife. The next night, as I was putting the finishing touches on my makeup, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway sent my heart racing. I glanced out the window, catching a glimpse of Horst, Mark's friend, stepping out of his sleek black car. Horst was tall, broad-shouldered, and exuded a quiet confidence that made him seem larger than life. He carried himself with an easy swagger, the kind that suggested he was used to being in control. Mark greeted him at the door with a hearty handshake and a laugh, their camaraderie palpable. Sarah? Mark called, his voice unusually cheerful. Come meet our guest of honor. I descended the stairs slowly, my nerves on edge. Horst's eyes met mine as I entered the room, and his lips curled into a charming smile. So this is the famous Sarah, he said, his deep voice warm but teasing. Mark's told me so much about you. All good things, I hope, I replied, forcing a polite smile. Of course, Horst said, his gaze lingering on me a moment longer than necessary. As the evening wore on, we sat around the dining table, the conversation flowing easily. Horst had a way of drawing people in, his stories captivating and his humor disarming. But as the night deepened, the mood shifted. Mark leaned back in his chair, his hand resting on my shoulder. Sarah, he said, his tone serious now. I think it's time to talk about why Horst is really here. My stomach tightened. Why is he here, Mark? He exchanged a glance with Horst, a silent conversation passing between them. I told you we needed to spice things up, Mark said, his voice steady but low. Horst can help us with that. My heart raced as I looked between the two of them, the implications of his words hanging heavily in the air. Horst leaned forward then, his gaze locking with mine. You trust Mark, don't you? He asked, his voice calm but commanding. Of course I do, I said, though my voice wavered. Then trust him now, Horst said simply. I glanced at Mark, searching his face for reassurance. His expression was steady, his eyes filled with a strange mix of excitement and anticipation. This is crazy, I said, shaking my head. Maybe, Mark admitted, his hand tightening on my shoulder. But isn't that what we need? A little bit of crazy. The tension in the room was suffocating, the silence broken only by the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. Horst stood then, his movements slow and deliberate. I'll leave the decision up to you, he said, his gaze steady on me. But if you're willing to take the leap, I promise you won't regret it. With that, he stepped out of the room, leaving Mark and me alone in the heavy silence. Sarah, Mark said softly, his voice almost pleading. Just think about it. Please. I nodded, my thoughts a whirlwind as I watched Horst's silhouette disappear into the next room. The minutes after Horst left the room felt like hours. Mark sat silently, his fingers drumming lightly on the edge of the table, his eyes fixed on me. I could feel the weight of his anticipation, the way his gaze bore into me as he waited for my response. "This is insane," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Mark leaned forward, his expression softening. "I know it sounds different, but that's the point, Sarah. We need this." "Need what exactly?" I shot back, my frustration breaking through the surface. "What are you even asking me to do?" Mark hesitated, his confidence faltering for the first time. "I'm asking you to trust me. To trust us?" I looked away, my chest tightening. The idea was absurd, but a small, nagging part of me couldn't ignore the curiosity bubbling beneath my fear. Horse reappeared moments later, his expression calm and unreadable. He took his seat at the table again, his movements deliberate and controlled. "I understand if you're hesitant," he said, his deep voice breaking the tension. "But sometimes, stepping out of your comfort zone can lead to incredible things." Mark nodded, his gaze flickering to me. "He's right, Sarah. This is a chance for us to reconnect, to reignite something we've lost." "And what about you, Horse?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "What do you get out of this?" Horse smiled faintly, his eyes meeting mine. "I'm here to help. Nothing more." His calm demeanor only made me more uneasy, but there was something disarming about him, something I couldn't quite place. The rest of the evening passed in a haze. Horse excused himself to make a phone call, leaving Mark and me alone in the room once more. "Sarah," Mark said, his voice low. "I know this feels like a lot, but I wouldn't have brought it up if I didn't believe it could help us." I stared at him, my mind racing. What if it doesn't? What if this just makes things worse? "It won't," he said firmly. "I know it won't." The conviction in his voice was enough to make me pause. Despite everything, I wanted to believe him. "Fine," I said finally, my voice trembling. "But I need to know you're sure about this." "I'm sure," he said, his smile returning. The next day, Mark and I spent the morning tidying up the house. He seemed more relaxed than I'd seen him in months, humming softly to himself as he worked. "You're awfully chipper," I said, my tone laced with sarcasm. He grinned at me over his shoulder. "It's hard not to be. This feels exciting." I rolled my eyes, but a small part of me couldn't help but agree. As strange as it was, the anticipation of what was to come had stirred something inside me, a spark of curiosity I hadn't felt in years. Horse arrived just as the sun was setting, his presence filling the room as he stepped inside. He carried a small duffel bag, which he set down carefully by the door. "Ready?" he asked, his eyes flickering between Mark and me. Mark nodded, his confidence unwavering. "We're ready." I wasn't so sure, but I forced a smile, hoping it was convincing enough. Horse moved through the room with practiced ease, setting up a small tripod in the corner. Mark helped him, their quiet conversation punctuated by the occasional laugh. I stood off to the side, my nerves growing with each passing moment. "What's all this for?" I asked finally, unable to keep silent any longer. "Just a little documentation," Horse said casually. "You'll appreciate it later." Mark glanced at me, his expression reassuring. "It's just part of the process, Sarah. Don't overthink it." But how could I not? When everything was finally in place, Horse turned to us, his expression serious. "The most important thing is to let go of any inhibitions," he said. "This only works if you're both fully committed." Mark nodded eagerly, but I hesitated, my chest tightening. "I don't know if I can do this." "Yes, you can," Mark said, stepping closer to me. "We can do this together." His words were meant to be comforting, but they only made the knot in my stomach tighten. "Just take it one step at a time," Horse said, his voice calm and steady. I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath as I tried to steady myself. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the camera, its tiny red light blinking steadily in the corner. "Whenever you're ready," Horse said. I opened my eyes, my gaze meeting Mark's. His expression was soft, filled with a mix of encouragement and anticipation. "Okay," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. The room felt warmer than before, the weight of anticipation pressing down on me like a heavy blanket. Mark stood beside me, his hand brushing lightly against mine in a silent gesture of reassurance. Across the room, Horst adjusted the tripod, his movements deliberate and unhurried. "Relax," he said, his deep voice breaking the silence. "This is supposed to be enjoyable." Easy for him to say. My nerves were wound so tightly I thought I might snap. Mark leaned closer, his voice low. "Sarah, it's just us. No one's judging. Just take a deep breath." I nodded, inhaling shakily as I tried to calm the whirlwind in my chest. Horst stepped toward us, his presence commanding but not overbearing. "Let's start slow," he said, his tone soothing. "The goal here is to reconnect, to rediscover each other. That's all." Mark reached for my hand, his touch warm and steady. "We've got this," he murmured. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the camera, its blinking red light a constant reminder of the uncharted territory we were venturing into. Horst gestured toward the couch. "Why don't you sit down? Make yourselves comfortable." We moved as if in a trance, settling onto the cushions. Horst remained standing, his gaze thoughtful as he observed us. "Tell me something," he said, addressing Mark. "What's the one thing you love most about Sarah?" Mark smiled, his grip on my hand tightening. "Her kindness," he said without hesitation. "She has this way of making people feel at ease, even when they're struggling." I felt my cheeks flush at his words, a warmth spreading through me despite the awkwardness of the situation. "And Sarah," Horst said, turning his attention to me, "what's one thing you admire about Mark?" I hesitated, my heart pounding. "His determination," I said finally. "He never gives up, no matter how hard things get." Mark glanced at me, his expression softening. "Thank you," he said quietly. Horst nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "That's a good start. Connection is built on trust, and trust comes from acknowledging what you value in each other." The tension in the room began to ease, replaced by a tentative sense of comfort. "Now," Horst said, his tone shifting slightly, "let's take it a step further." My pulse quickened as he moved closer, his gaze steady but unreadable. "I want you to focus on each other, really focus. Forget about me. Forget about the camera. Just be present in this moment." Mark turned to me, his eyes searching mine. For a moment, it felt as though we were the only two people in the room, the weight of the past few months melting away under his gaze. "You're beautiful," he said softly, his voice tinged with vulnerability. I felt a lump rise in my throat, his words catching me off guard. "Thank you," I whispered, my voice trembling. Horst stepped back, giving us space as he observed quietly. His presence was almost forgotten as Mark leaned closer, his hand brushing against my cheek. "We've been through so much," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I don't want to lose what we have." "You haven't lost me," I replied, my chest tightening. "I'm still here." The moment stretched on, the air between us thick with unspoken emotions. Horst's voice broke the silence, low and steady. "You're doing great. Just let it happen naturally." I glanced at him then, his calm demeanor grounding me. "This feels strange," I admitted. "That's normal," he said simply. "Growth always feels strange at first." Mark squeezed my hand, his gaze never leaving mine. "It's okay," he said softly. "We're in this together." For the first time that evening, I felt a sense of peace, as though the weight of my doubts had begun to lift. As the session continued, Horst guided us gently, his words encouraging but never forceful. Slowly but surely, the barriers between us began to dissolve, replaced by a renewed sense of connection. By the time the evening drew to a close, I felt lighter than I had in months, the tension that had defined our relationship replaced by something deeper, more meaningful. As Horst packed up his equipment, he turned to us with a satisfied smile. "You've made a lot of progress tonight," he said. "Thank you," Mark said, his gratitude evident. Horst nodded, his gaze flickering to me. "You're stronger than you think, Sarah. Don't forget that." With that, he left, the sound of his car fading into the night. Mark turned to me then, his expression soft. How do you feel? Tired, I admitted, though a small smile tugged at my lips. But hopeful. He pulled me into a gentle embrace, his touch grounding me. We're going to be okay, he said softly. For the first time in a long while, I believed him. The next morning, the house felt unusually quiet. The sunlight streaming through the windows seemed brighter than usual, casting long beams of warmth across the kitchen. Mark was already up, his mug of coffee steaming on the counter as he flipped through the morning paper. Sleep well? He asked, his tone light. I nodded, pouring myself a cup. Better than I expected. His lips quirked into a small smile. You seemed lighter last night. Like a weight had been lifted. I took a sip of coffee, my thoughts lingering on Horse's parting words. You're stronger than you think. Maybe I was carrying more than I realized, I admitted, my voice quiet. Mark reached for my hand, his touch warm. I know this wasn't easy for you, Sarah. But I'm proud of you. His words settled over me like a balm, soothing the raw edges of my nerves. For the first time in a long while, I felt a flicker of hope. Not just for us, but for myself. Later that afternoon, the sound of tires crunching on gravel caught my attention. I glanced out the window to see Horse's sleek black car pulling into the driveway. What's he doing here? I muttered, setting my mug down and wiping my hands on a dish towel. Mark appeared behind me, a grin spreading across his face. Probably just checking in. When Horse stepped through the door, he carried the same quiet confidence as before, his presence filling the room effortlessly. I hope I'm not interrupting, he said, his tone polite but direct. Not at all, Mark said, clapping him on the shoulder. Horse's gaze flickered to me, his eyes softening. I wanted to see how you were doing. I'm fine, I said, though my voice betrayed the swirl of emotions his presence stirred. The three of us sat in the living room, the conversation flowing easily. Horse had a way of making even the most mundane topics seem engaging, his deep voice carrying a quiet authority that commanded attention. But as the afternoon wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more behind his visit. You've been awfully quiet, Horse said, turning to me. What's on your mind? I hesitated, my thoughts racing. I guess I'm still trying to process everything. That's natural, he said, his tone reassuring. Big changes take time to settle. Mark leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. Do you think we're on the right track? Horse's smile was faint but genuine. I think you're closer than you realize. As the afternoon turned into evening, Horse rose from his seat, brushing invisible dust from his jacket. I should get going, he said. Mark stood as well, shaking his hand firmly. Thanks again, Horse. For everything. Horse nodded, then turned to me. Sarah, he said, his gaze steady. If you ever need anything, don't hesitate to reach out. His words carried a weight that lingered long after he'd left, the sound of his car fading into the distance. That night, as Mark and I sat on the porch watching the stars, I found myself reflecting on the past few days. Do you think this will last? I asked softly, my gaze fixed on the horizon. Mark reached for my hand, his touch grounding me. I think it's up to us. His words were simple, but they carried a truth I couldn't ignore. For all the guidance Horse had offered, the real work lay ahead of us. The weeks that followed were filled with small but significant changes. Mark and I made an effort to spend more time together, rediscovering the things that had drawn us to each other in the first place. Horse's name came up occasionally, usually in passing, but his presence lingered in subtle ways, a reminder of the path we'd chosen to take. And while the road ahead wasn't without its challenges, I felt a renewed sense of purpose, a belief that we could weather whatever storms came our way. One evening, as we sat together on the couch, Mark turned to me with a mischievous grin. You know, he said, his tone teasing, you never asked how Horse got his nickname. I laughed, shaking my head. I figured it was just one of those things. Well, Mark said, his grin widening, let's just say it's a story for another time. His laughter echoed through the room, and for the first time in a long while, I found myself laughing with him, the weight of the past finally giving way to something lighter, something brighter.